Medieval prisons were not designed for justice, rehabilitation, or even long-term confinement. They were instruments of fear, neglect, and slow punishment, places where the human body decayed as surely as hope itself. What follows is a factual look at how these prisons truly functioned, and why survival inside them was often a matter of luck, money, or outside mercy rather than law. Medieval prisons were not places to serve time. They were places to lose health, dignity, and often life itself. If you entered one poor, alone, and forgotten, the prison did not need to execute you. It simply waited. Close your eyes now and let the modern world dissolve into the velvet shadows of the past, leaving behind the electric hum of the present for the quiet, damp echo of stone and iron. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, imagine the air growing cooler, heavy with the scent of wet straw, ancient masonry, and the faint metallic tang of rust as we step into the waiting room of judgment. To understand the medieval prison, we must first unlearn almost everything we know about modern incarceration, for in the Middle Ages, the very concept of doing time as a punishment was largely alien, a bizarre and costly abstraction that few kings or sheriffs had the patience to maintain. In our world, the prison is the destination, the penalty paid for a crime committed, but in the 12th or 13th century, the prison was merely a pause, a breathless and terrifying hiatus between the accusation and the verdict. It was a container, a keep in the most literal sense, designed to hold the body of the accused so that they could not flee the king's justice before the traveling judges, known as the justices of eyre or assize, arrived in town. This arrival might take weeks, months, or in some neglected cases, years, during which the prisoner existed in a state of suspended animation, neither condemned nor free, trapped in a legal and physical limbo. The Roman jurist Ulpian, whose writings deeply influenced medieval legal theory, had famously declared carcer enim ad continendos homines, non ad puniendos haberi debet. Prison ought to be used for detaining men, not for punishing them. And this maxim was repeated by medieval scholars like Bracton, though the reality on the ground was often far grimmer than the Latin theory suggested. The prison was the dark anteroom to the true punishments of the era, the sharp bite of the whip, the heavy fines that stripped a family of its livelihood, the public shame of the stocks, or the finality of the gallows. Because the authorities viewed these stone cages as temporary holding pens, they felt absolutely no moral or legal obligation to make them habitable. After all, if you were innocent, God would surely deliver you. And if you were guilty, your suffering in the dark was merely a prelude to the justice you deserved. There is a dark irony here, of course, because while the law insisted that imprisonment was not the punishment, the conditions of the custody were often lethal in themselves, creating a system where a man might easily die of jail fever, a polite term for typhus, long before he ever had the chance to plead his innocence before a magistrate. Historians still argue whether the shift toward using prison as a punishment in itself began earlier than we think, perhaps with the church's use of confinement for wayward monks. But for the common thief or the unfortunate debtor in a royal castle, the theological debates mattered little compared to the gnawing hunger in their bellies. The medieval prison system was essentially a warehousing operation for human bodies, a place where the sheriff, who was personally responsible for producing the prisoner at trial, simply stored his inventory to ensure it didn't wander off into the forest. This custodial nature explains why there were no uniform standards, no inspections, and no attempts at rehabilitation. You do not rehabilitate a package you are merely storing until the recipient arrives to collect it. It was a world of radical uncertainty, where time did not march in hours or minutes, but stretched and warped in the darkness, marked only by the shifting of the guards or the tolling of a distant church bell that reminded you of the life continuing without you outside the walls. To be imprisoned was to be removed from the king's peace, to be effectively dead to the world while still breathing, a status that stripped you of agency and left you entirely dependent on the charity of others or the whims of a jailer who likely viewed you as nothing more than a source of potential bribes. The waiting room was not a passive place. It was an active predator, slowly consuming the resources and the health of those unfortunate enough to be caught in its grip. We often imagine these places as bustling dungeons filled with the dramatic screams of the tortured, but the truth is often quieter and more depressing. The primary sound of a medieval prison was likely the coughing of sick men and the scuffling of rats, a soundscape of monotonous misery rather than high drama. It is worth noting, with a touch of grim humor, that medieval bureaucracy was just as inefficient as our own, but instead of losing your paperwork, they simply lost you, sometimes forgetting a prisoner in a remote tower cell until he had starved, a clerical error with fatal consequences. The delivery of the jail, the clearing out of prisoners for trial, was a major event, a sudden burst of sunlight and terror after months of stagnation, where the guests were finally brought blinking into the light to face their fate. But until that moment, the prisoner remained in the shadows, suspended in the amber of waiting, learning the hard lesson that in the Middle Ages, justice was swift, but the law was agonizingly slow. As we drift deeper into this history, we must understand that the filthy truth begins not with the dirt on the floor, but with this fundamental purpose. The prison was a place built for neglect, a stone box designed to keep the world out and the prisoner in, until the machinery of the state finally decided to grind into motion. The concept of habeas corpus, that you have the body, was not a right to freedom, but a literal command to the jailer to bring the physical person of the prisoner to the court, a task that became increasingly difficult as the months of malnutrition and disease took their toll. Thus, the medieval prison existed as a strange paradox, a place of law that felt entirely lawless, a government institution that was privately run for profit, and a temporary holding cell that frequently became a permanent tomb. It is in this gap between the legal theory of custody and the physical reality of rot that the true horror of the medieval prison lies, a horror not of active malice, but of profound and deadly indifference. As we prepare to look closer at the walls themselves, remember that for the medieval mind, the suffering of the body was often seen as a reflection of the soul's state, and to wait in the darkness was, perhaps, the ultimate test of faith or the ultimate proof of abandonment. The darkness here is not empty. It is full of the unseen, the unspoken, and the forgotten, a crowded silence that presses against the ears and the heart. The architecture itself was complicit in this suffering, for the buildings were rarely purpose-built prisons, but rather scavenged spaces, leftovers of defense and fortification that were turned inward to trap the enemy within. And so, having understood why these places existed, not to correct, but to keep, we must now turn our eyes to the physical structures themselves, the shells of stone and iron that housed this misery, and see how the very walls were weaponized against those who dwelled within them. When we look for the medieval prison in the landscape of the past, we rarely find a distinct building type designed solely for incarceration, for the medieval mind did not waste good stone on the condemned when there were perfectly good basements, towers, and gatehouses already standing. The architecture of misery was almost always an architecture of convenience, a scavenging of existing fortifications where the thick walls intended to keep enemies out served equally well to keep prisoners in. We must imagine the medieval landscape not dotted with penitentiaries, but rather with strongholds where the prison was a secondary parasitic function, growing like mold within the shell of a castle or a city wall. Most often, the jail was located in the very heart of the city's defenses, particularly in the gatehouses that controlled the flow of traffic in and out of the town, creating a cruel paradox where the prisoner was held directly above the free movement of the bustling market, hearing the carts and the laughter of the streets just inches through the masonry, yet utterly removed from it. Newgate Prison in London, perhaps the most infamous of them all, began its life quite literally as a new gate in the Roman wall, eventually expanded to house the overflow of humanity that the law had nowhere else to put. To be imprisoned, there was to be buried in the city's own armor. These gatehouse prisons were often cramped, vertical affairs, stacking misery layer upon layer, where the common side for the poor was often the cellar or the dank ground floor closest to the open sewer of the city ditch, while the master's side, for the wealthy, occupied the upper area rooms. The stone itself was often weeping, a term used to describe walls so saturated with groundwater and the condensation of human breath that they seemed to be perpetually crying, slick with a slime that never dried. In the great castles of the countryside, the prison was usually tucked away in the keep or the donjon, the safest and strongest part of the fortress, which ironically meant that the prisoner was held in the symbolic heart of the Lord's power. Here the architecture dictated the suffering. These rooms were built for defense, not habitation, meaning windows were mere arrow slits, narrow vertical gashes in the stone that let in a razor-thin slice of wind and rain, but very little light. The darkness in these chambers was not the total blackness of a cave, but a grey twilight gloom that strained the eyes and blurred the edges of reality, making the prisoner unsure if the shadow in the corner was a rat, a guard, or a hallucination. There is a specific type of architectural malice found in some of these keeps, known as the Little E's, a cell designed with such diabolical geometry that a grown man could neither stand up straight nor lie down fully extended, forcing the occupant into a permanent, cramping crouch that agonizingly twisted the spine and atrophied the muscles over days or weeks. Historians and architectural archaeologists still debate the extent to which these specific torture cells were standard features or rare exceptions exaggerated by later Gothic romances. But the physical evidence in places like the Tower of London suggests that specialized architectural cruelty was certainly within the repertoire of the medieval mason. Even without such specialized designs, the standard cell was a hostile environment. The floors were often packed earth or uneven flagstones that turned to ice in the winter, sucking the heat directly out of the body through the soles of the feet. Ventilation was a disaster of physics. Because these cells were often located at the bottom of towers or buried partially underground to prevent tunneling, the air inside was stagnant, heavy with carbon dioxide and the stench of waste, creating a suffocating miasma that physicians of the time correctly identified as a source of death, even if they didn't understand the bacteriology behind it. In some castle prisons, the only ventilation came from the squint, or a small grate in the ceiling, through which the guard might peer down, turning the prisoner into a specimen in a jar. It is a grimly humorous thought that in a world where glass windows were a luxury for the rich, the prisoner often had the most secure housing in the kingdom, though the rent was paid in blood and sanity. The use of the town tower or bridge tower was also common, where a toll booth or a defensive turret on a bridge, like the one on the old London Bridge, was converted into a holding cell, suspending the prisoner over the rushing, freezing water of the river below, adding the relentless sound of the current to the psychological torment. This repurposing of space meant that no two prisons were alike. One might be a dry, windy attic in a high turret where the cold bit like a dog, and another might be a dripping fungal cave beneath a courthouse where the walls sprouted mushrooms. The lack of standardized architecture meant that a prisoner's experience was entirely dependent on the specific geometry of the building they were thrown into. A round tower offered no corners to curl up in, while a square keep might have damp corners where the rot accumulated thickest. We must also consider the sensory experience of the shell, the acoustic properties of stone. These rooms were echo chambers, amplifying the coughs of the sick, the rattling of chains, and the shouts of the guards, creating a soundscape that was at once loud and incredibly lonely. The walls were often immensely thick, sometimes 10 or 15 feet, of rubble and ashlar, effectively silencing the world outside and creating a sense of being buried alive, a living tomb that pressed in on the chest. The security of these places relied not on complex locks, though heavy iron bolts were certainly used, but on the sheer mass of the structure. To escape, one would have to claw through feet of solid rock with bare hands, a feat that physics and malnutrition rendered impossible. The gatehouse prison, in particular, served as a visible warning to those entering the city. The sight of the barred, narrow windows and the knowledge of the wretches inside acted as a grim billboard for the king's justice, an architectural integration of terror into the daily commute of the merchant and the peasant. It is fascinating to realize that many of these structures were essentially hollow pillars of stone, with wooden platforms built inside to create floors. If a fire broke out, as it often did in the wooden cities of the Middle Ages, the prison became a chimney, trapping the occupants in a terrifying inferno, a risk that was just another hazard of the architecture. The sheer improvisation of medieval incarceration is what strikes the modern observer most. A cellar used for storing wine barrels one decade might be storing heretics the next, with the lingering scent of old vintage mixing with the new scent of despair. As we run our hands mentally over the rough, cold texture of these walls, we realize that the cruelty was built into the very blueprints, or rather, the lack of them. The indifference of the state was solidified in mortar and rock, creating spaces that were hostile to biological life by their very nature. The stone shell was not just a container. It was an environment that actively worked to break the human spirit through damp, cold, and the crushing weight of the masonry itself. And yet, for all the horror of the gatehouse and the tower, there was a deeper, darker architecture that we have not yet explored. A design so absolute in its finality that it has become the very symbol of forgottenness. We must now leave the comfort of the tower room and the gatehouse cell to look down into the floor, where a simple trapdoor leads to a darkness that has no name but one. A place where the architecture ceases to be a room and becomes a throat. If the tower cell was a purgatory of waiting, the oubliette was the hell of forgetting. A specific architectural horror designed to erase a human being from the memory of the world while they were still breathing. To find it, we must leave the corridors and the spiral staircases and look to the floor, where a heavy iron grate or a thick wooden trapdoor sits innocuous and flush with the flagstones, a dark eye that looks only downward into the earth. The word itself, oubliette, is a chilling derivative of the French verb oublier, meaning to forget, and its very etymology serves as its mission statement. This was not a place for holding, but a place for disappearing. In the structural anatomy of a castle, these chambers were often referred to as bottle dungeons because of their distinct, terrifying geometry. A narrow, tubular neck at the top, just wide enough for a man's shoulders to pass through, opening up into a wider, bell-shaped cavern below. There were no doors, no windows, and certainly no stairs. The only way in was through the ceiling, and the only way out was by the same rope or ladder that had lowered you down, if the jailer ever decided to bring it back. Often, prisoners were not lowered gently, but simply dropped. A fall of 10 or 20 feet into the blackness, leaving them with broken ankles or shattered legs to heal crookedly in the dark. A cruel greeting from their new home. Once the trapdoor above slammed shut, the darkness became absolute, a physical weight that pressed against the eyes, creating a sensory deprivation so profound that the mind, desperate for stimulus, would begin to invent its own light, conjuring hallucinations of shapes and figures that danced in the void. Historians and archaeologists still debate the true prevalence of these dungeons, with some arguing that many spaces identified as oubliettes by dramatic Victorian tour guides were actually just ice houses, storerooms, or latrines. Though one might argue that for the prisoner thrown into a cesspit, the academic distinction between a toilet and a cell was largely irrelevant. What is historically certain is that such vertical pits existed and were used, particularly in places like Warwick Castle or the chilling depths of the Bastille, where the lower depths were legendary for their damp and silence. In these stone bottles, the air was a stagnant, heavy fluid, sinking to the bottom and pooling there, rich with carbon dioxide and the metallic scent of old fear. Ventilation was non-existent, meaning the prisoner breathed the same air over and over again, a suffocating cycle that left the head pounding and the lungs starving for oxygen. The floor of the oubliette was rarely paved. It was often raw earth or bedrock, sometimes slick with the seepage of the water table, or worse, cluttered with the debris of previous occupants. In the most neglected of these pits, a prisoner might find themselves sitting among the dry, scattered bones of those who had come before. a literal memento mori that served as a silent roommate in the solitary confinement. There is a distinct, quiet horror in the fact that the oubliette turned the prisoner's world into a vertical experience. They spent their days craning their necks upward, staring at the thin line of light around the trapdoor, the eye of God, which was their only connection to the sun, the seasons, and the living world. Food, when it came, was dropped from above, a crust of bread or a piece of meat falling through the dark like a stone, forcing the prisoner to crawl on hands and knees, feeling blindly across the filth of the floor to find their sustenance before the rats did. And indeed, the rats were often the only visitors, scurrying down the rough masonry of the walls, bold and unafraid in their own domain. To survive in an oubliette was to become a creature of pure instinct, shedding the layers of civilization and complex thought in favor of the singular drive to breathe and eat. The psychological toll was often more lethal than the physical deprivation. In the total absence of light and conversation, the sense of time dissolved completely. A day could feel like a month, and an hour like a year. Prisoners would try to mark time by the rhythm of the meals dropped from above. But if the jailer forgot, or was bribed to forget, the calendar vanished, and the prisoner was left drifting in a timeless void. It was a passive execution, a way for the lord or the castellan to kill a man without bloodying his hands. He simply stopped sending the basket down, and nature took its course. There is a grim sort of efficiency to it, a landlord's solution to a tenant who has overstayed his welcome, removing the need for guards, locks, or maintenance. Yet despite the horror, stories of survival exist, tales of men who survived on dripping water and sheer will, or who managed to climb the sheer walls by finding toe-holds in the masonry, though these are rare flickers of hope in a very deep history of despair. The oubliette represented the ultimate power of the state, the power to unmake a person, to turn a subject into a non-entity, a ghost haunting the foundations of the castle while the court danced and feasted on the floors above, completely oblivious or willfully ignorant of the breathing misery beneath their feet. It was the architectural embodiment of the phrase, out of sight, out of mind. As we linger for a moment in this crushing quiet, imagining the cool, damp air on our skin and the absolute silence that rings in the ears, we realize that the true terror of the medieval prison was not just the pain, but the helplessness. But for those who were merely in the common jail and not the pit, there was still a way to survive, a lifeline that dangled not from a rope, but from a purse. We must now climb out of this suffocating depth, up through the trapdoor, and back into the dim corridors of the general prison, to discover a different kind of horror, the cold, hard realization that in the medieval dungeon, everything, absolutely everything, came with a price tag. Rising from the suffocating silence of the oubliette, we return to the bustling, murky corridors of the common jail, where a different sound dominates the air. It is not the scream of the tortured or the prayer of the penitent, but a sharp, rhythmic clinking that echoes against the stone. At first, you might mistake it for the rattle of fetters, and indeed, iron is part of it. But listen closer. It is the sound of coins striking a palm. It is the sound of commerce. To understand the day-to-day reality of a medieval prison, we must discard the modern notion of a state-funded institution, and instead imagine a bizarre, predatory hotel where the concierge is armed, the guests are involuntary, and the bill is non-negotiable. In the Middle Ages, the position of a jailer was rarely a salaried job paid for by the crown or the city. Instead, it was a private franchise, a business opportunity that one often had to purchase, sometimes for a considerable sum. The wardenship of the Fleet prison in London, for example, was a piece of freehold property that could be inherited, sold, or mortgaged like a manor house or a watermill. The man holding the keys had likely gone into debt to acquire them, and he intended to make a return on his investment with the aggressive efficiency of any other merchant. The prison was his shop, and the prisoners were his customers, a captive market in the most literal and terrifying sense. Upon crossing the threshold, the new arrival was immediately introduced to this economy of extortion through a ritual often called garnish, chummage, or simply footing. Before being shown to a cell or given a scrap of food, the prisoner was expected to pay an entrance fee, a welcome tax demanded by the jailer for the privilege of being processed. It is a moment of dark, bureaucratic absurdity. Standing in chains, covered in the dust of the road, and being asked to open a purse to pay for the roof that is about to imprison you. If the prisoner had money, the transaction was smooth, and they might be shown to a master's side room with a bed and a window. If they had no money, the garnish was often taken from their very backs. Jailers would strip a poor man of his cloak, his tunic, or his boots, selling them to a fence to cover the entrance fee, leaving the prisoner half naked to face the dungeon chill. Historians have noted that this practice was so ingrained that it developed its own perverse etiquette, with senior prisoners sometimes assisting the jailer in shaking down the newcomers, creating a micro-society where the oppressed preyed on the newly arrived to curry favor with the oppressor. Once inside, the menu of fees expanded into a dizzying array of microtransactions that would make a modern landlord blush. There was a fee for turning the key, literally a charge every time the jailer had to unlock the door to let you in or out, or to bring you a visitor. There was a fee for bedding, which usually meant a pile of straw that hadn't been changed since the last occupant died on it. If you wanted fresh straw, that cost extra. There was a fee for a candle, a luxury that transformed a pitch-black cell into a habitable room, and a fee for water that wasn't scooped from the stagnant puddle in the courtyard. Perhaps the most sinister item on this menu was the sweetment of irons, or the easement of irons. By default, a prisoner might be loaded with heavy, crushing shackles, heavies, that weighed 20 pounds or more, chafing the skin to the bone and making sleep impossible. However, for a few silver pennies a week, the jailer would graciously agree to swap these for lights, a lighter set of chains that allowed movement, or for a gold coin, remove them altogether. This was the economy of pain. The jailer inflicted suffering not out of malice, but as a sales tactic, creating a problem for which he happily sold the solution. It brings a grim new meaning to the idea of a captive audience. Food and drink were the other great revenue streams. Since the Crown provided little to no food allowance, often just a penny a day or nothing at all, the jailer held a monopoly on sustenance. Many prisons operated their own internal tap rooms or alehouses, run by the warden or his wife, where prisoners with funds could buy bread, meat, and beer at inflated prices. It is a strange image to conjure. A dungeon that doubles as a tavern, where the wealthy accused could sit on a bench, drinking overpriced, watered-down ale served by the man who held them captive, while the poor starved a few feet away. We might allow ourselves a small wry smile at the thought that the captive market has always been the dream of every retailer, though the wine list in a medieval dungeon likely left much to be desired. Vintage vinegar with notes of despair. Yet for those without coin, this system was a death sentence. To be poor in a medieval prison was to be invisible to the economy of the place, and thus invisible to the care of the staff. The jailer had no incentive to keep a non-paying customer alive. In fact, a dead pauper cleared up space for a potential paying one. The final and perhaps most cruel twist of this economic machinery came at the end of the sentence. Let us imagine a prisoner who has survived the filth, paid his garnish, bought his food, and finally, after months of waiting, is hauled before the judge. Let us assume the best. He is found innocent. The jury acquits him. The judge bangs his gavel, or rather his staff, and declares him a free man. He turns to leave the court, his heart soaring, only to be dragged back to the cell. Why? Because he has not paid his quit fee or discharge fee. The jailer demanded a final payment for the administrative trouble of releasing him. And until this debt was settled, the innocent man remained a prisoner. There are tragic records of men who were acquitted of all crimes but died in prison years later, simply because they could not afford the price of their own freedom. It was a trap with sticky walls, a system where debt was the true chain, harder to break than any iron shackle. The prison was, in many ways, a microcosm of the feudal world outside, but distilled and concentrated, where money was the only shield against the raw brutality of existence. This filthy truth of the prison economy changes how we see the jailer. He was not necessarily the sadist of Hollywood movies, cackling as he turned the screw. He was often a banal, bored businessman, checking his ledger, worried about his profit margins, and viewing human suffering as a commodity to be weighed and sold. The clink of coins was the heartbeat of the prison, a rhythm that dictated who ate, who slept, and who survived. As the sun sets outside and the prison taproom quiets down, the transactions of the day settle into the ledger, and the reality of the environment takes over. Money could buy you a lighter chain, a cup of wine, or a candle, but it could not buy you a way out of the fundamental physical reality of the medieval jail. It could not buy you sunlight, it could not buy you dry air, and it could not buy you warmth in the stone belly of the keep. As the candle, paid for with your last copper, flickers and dies, the darkness returns, absolute and heavy. We must now let the coins drop from our hands and feel the air itself, for in the absence of light, the other senses take over, and we begin to understand what it truly felt like to live inside a cloud of stone. With the last coin spent and the final candle sputtering into a pool of warm wax, the prison returns to its natural state, a kingdom of shadows where the primary currency is not gold, but endurance. We must now strip away the social structures of the jailer and the judge to confront the raw physical environment of the cell itself, a sensory landscape so hostile that it waged a constant, silent war against the biology of those trapped within. To sit in a medieval dungeon is to sit inside the earth's own mouth, a place where the elements of water, stone, and air conspire to dismantle the human body one shivering hour at a time. The first thing that greets you is not a sight, but a temperature, a pervasive, bone-deep cold that defies clothing. Remember, these were ages before central heating, where even kings shivered in their drafty great halls. But in the prison, the cold was magnified by the thermal mass of the masonry. The walls, often 10 feet thick, acted as massive heat sinks, sucking the warmth from the air and from the bodies huddled against them. In winter, the temperature inside a keep could drop below freezing, turning the water in the bucket to ice and frosting the breath of the sleepers. In summer, the deep subterranean chambers remained aggressively cool, a clammy chill that settled in the joints and never left. It was a cold that felt wet, a heavy, clinging atmosphere that penetrated wool and linen alike, making the simple act of sitting still an exercise in hypothermia. This wetness was no illusion, for the medieval prison was a hydrological nightmare, because many were built into the foundations of castles or the cellars of city gates. They frequently sat below the water table. In London's Fleet Prison, the ditch outside often seeped through the masonry, while in the dungeons of coastal castles, like St. Andrews in Scotland, the salt spray and the damp fog were permanent residents. The walls themselves were often described as weeping, covered in a slick, bioluminescent sheen of condensation and niter, potassium nitrate, that bloomed like white mold on the rock. Touching the wall meant pulling back a hand coated in cold slime, a tactile reminder that the building itself was sweating. For the prisoner, this meant that nothing was ever truly dry. The straw mattress absorbed the moisture from the floor, the clothes grew heavy and stiff with damp, and the skin began to soften and break down, a condition later known as trench foot, but then simply accepted as the rotting of the extremities. Medieval medicine, governed by the theory of the four humors, viewed this environment with terrified awe. Physicians believed that such cold and damp conditions created an excess of phlegm and black bile, unbalancing the body and leading inevitably to melancholy and madness. In this specific case, the doctors were entirely correct. The environment was physically depressing the occupants to death. Then, there was the darkness. We must strain our imagination to understand true pre-industrial darkness, a blackness so absolute that it feels like a physical weight pressing against the eyes. In the lower cells, or the pits, sunlight was a rumor, a faint grey dilution of the dark that might filter down a ventilation shaft at noon, only to vanish an hour later. For the rest of the day, the prisoner existed in a twilight gloom or total obscurity. This stone blindness forced the other senses to overcompensate. Hearing became razor sharp. The scuff of a guard's boot on the stairs or the distant creak of a windlass became monumental events. Touch became the primary way of navigating the world. Prisoners learned the geography of their cells by the texture of the floor, the rough grit of the mortar, and the slickness of the damp patches. Historians and ophthalmologists suggest that long-term confinement in such low light could permanently damage the vision, leading to extreme sensitivity or miner's nystagmus, where the eyes oscillate uncontrollably in a desperate attempt to find a focal point. Yet the human brain is adaptable, and prisoners spoke of dungeon eyes, a gradual adjustment that allowed them to see shapes and movement in conditions where a new arrival would see nothing but ink. It is a small, grim miracle of our biology that we can learn to see in hell, provided we stay there long enough. And then, inevitably, there was the smell. It is difficult to narrate a scent, but we must try to conjure the olfactory wall that hit anyone opening the heavy oak door. It was a dense, layered miasma, composed of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, stale breath, and the unavoidable reality of the slop bucket. Sanitation was primitive to non-existent. In many cells, the privy was simply a bucket in the corner that might be emptied once a day or once a week, depending on the jailer's mood. In the worst crowded wards, the floor itself became the latrine. The air was so thick with ammonia and methane that it reportedly stung the eyes of visiting chaplains, who would often hold vinegar-soaked sponges to their noses to ward off the stench. This jail fever smell was not just unpleasant. It was believed to be infectious, a poisonous vapor that could kill a man simply by being inhaled. Interestingly, modern science vindicates this medieval fear to a degree. While the smell itself wasn't the bacteria, the filth that generated it was the breeding ground for the vectors of typhus and dysentery. One might joke that the air quality in a medieval dungeon was the original effective crowd control, discouraging anyone from visiting too long. Yet, the most terrifying aspect of the smell was the nose blindness that eventually set in. After days or weeks, the prisoner ceased to smell the horror, accepting the foul air as the new baseline of existence. When the stench of rot becomes normal, you know you have truly arrived. Sensory deprivation, or rather, sensory monotony, was the final torture of the environment. The lack of visual stimulation, the constant temperature, the unchanging smell, and the muted acoustic landscape created a vacuum that the mind tried desperately to fill. This is where the ghosts of the prison were born, not necessarily spirits of the dead, but hallucinations conjured by bored, starving brains. Prisoners reported seeing flashes of light, hearing voices of loved ones, or having long, lucid conversations with people who weren't there. It was the mind's way of defending itself against the crushing boredom of the stone box. The cell was a sensory deprivation tank built of limestone, a place where the boundaries between sleeping and waking blurred until they vanished completely. You might wake up shivering in the dark, unsure if you had slept for an hour or a day, unsure if the cold hand touching your face was a dream or a draught. As we sit in this damp, dark, and heavy silence, feeling the rough stone against our backs and smelling the ancient dust, we realize that the prison was not empty. It felt empty, yes, but that was an illusion. The darkness was teeming with life. We were never truly alone in the cell. While the humans withered and the hope decayed, there was a whole ecosystem that found this environment, this wet, dark, filth-ridden stone box, to be an absolute paradise. They were the unseen roommates, the only ones who moved freely through the walls, and the only ones who thrived on the misery of others. We must now shift our attention from the walls to the floor, to the rustling in the straw and the itch on the skin, as we meet the true masters of the medieval dungeon. If the walls of the medieval prison were the cold, unfeeling bones of the beast, then the vermin were its blood. A teeming, biting, scurrying life force that pulsed through the darkness when the human occupants tried to sleep. We must now lower our gaze to the floor, to the piles of matted, damp straw that served as beds, and acknowledge the unseen roommates who shared every breath and every scratching hour with the condemned. In the silence of the dungeon, the first sound you would likely hear is not a human voice, but the confident, scratching gait of the rat. These were not the shy creatures of the hedgerows, but the bold, oversized denizens of the city's underbelly, fattened on the refuse of the market and the neglect of the jail. To a prisoner shackled to the wall, The rat was a source of primal terror. Stories abounded of men waking to find them, gnawing on their boots, their leather jerkins, or worse, their numb toes. Yet in a twist of dark irony, the rat was also the only other living thing in the cell that was warm. And in the profound isolation of solitary confinement, some prisoners formed strange, desperate bonds with them, sharing their meager crusts of bread with the only creature that would visit them. Historians have found records of prisoners who tamed these rodents, naming them and treating them as pets, a heartbreaking testament to the human need for connection, even if that connection was a plague-carrying scavenger. But the rats were merely the visible generals of an army that waged a far more intimate war on the prisoner's body: the lice and the fleas. If you were thrown into a medieval prison, it was a biological certainty that within 24 hours you would be colonized. The louse was the great leveler of medieval society. It respected no rank, biting the lord and the thief with equal enthusiasm. Personal hygiene in a dungeon was an impossibility. Water was for drinking, not washing. And a change of clothes was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford to bribe a guard for. As a result, prisoners wore the same linen shirt for months, creating a warm, humid paradise for parasites. The itching was constant, a maddening, fiery prickling that moved across the skin like a living rash, making true rest impossible. This was the shirt of fire described in later texts, a torture that required no rack or thumbscrew, merely neglect. The fleas, thriving in the dirty straw of the floor, attacked from below, turning the legs into a landscape of red welts. We must imagine the physical toll of this. The constant scratching opened small wounds on the skin, which, in the filthy environment, quickly became infected, leading to the ulcers and sores that were the hallmark of the long-term prisoner. It is a grimly humorous thought that the busiest residents of the prison were the fleas, tirelessly working while the humans sat in idle despair. This biological soup was not just an annoyance, it was a weapon. The lice were the vectors for the most feared killer in the prison system: jail fever. We know it today as typhus, a bacterial disease spread by the feces of infected body lice. But to the medieval mind, it was a mysterious, deadly vapor that arose from the filth itself. It struck with terrifying speed, a high fever, a delirium that plunged the victim into a stupor, and a distinct rash. It killed far more prisoners than the hangman ever did. The death rates were staggering. In some years, a quarter of a prison's population might be swept away in a single season. The disease did not respect the bars of the cell. It clung to the clothes of the prisoners when they were hauled into court, creating one of the most famous medical disasters in history: the Black Assize of Oxford in 1577. In that event, a foul-smelling prisoner was brought before the court, and within weeks, the judge, the sheriff, the jury, and hundreds of spectators were dead from the fever he carried. It was a stark lesson to the outside world that the misery of the prison could not be contained behind stone walls. If you let a place rot, the rot eventually walks out the door. There is a fascinating scholarly debate about how much medieval authorities understood this connection. While they lacked the germ theory of disease, they were obsessed with miasma, or bad air. They believed that the stench of the prison corrupted the humors of the body. In a way, they were right for the wrong reasons. The smell was the signal of the danger. Even if the mechanism was an insect bite, rather than a toxic smell. This belief led to the widespread use of nosegays, small bouquets of strong-smelling herbs and flowers carried by judges and wealthy visitors to ward off the prison air. The tradition of judges carrying flowers into court persisted for centuries, a floral shield against the invisible death that radiated from the dock. For the prisoner, however, there were no flowers. There was only the prison cough, the prison itch, and the slow realization that their own body was becoming a landscape of decay. The psychological impact of being eaten alive by parasites cannot be overstated. It stripped away the last veneer of human dignity, reducing a man to an animal constantly grooming itself in the dark. And yet, despite the rats, the lice, and the fever, the biological imperative of the prisoner remained simple: survival. The body, besieged by cold and bitten by vermin, made one final, overwhelming demand. It needed fuel. The parasites were feeding on the prisoner, but the prisoner had to feed on something, too. This brings us to the most precarious and brutal aspect of the medieval prison economy. We have spoken of the need for money, but money was useless without a supply chain. In a place where the king provided the walls, but not the dinner, how did a man eat? We must now turn our eyes from the floor to the door, listening for the rattle of a cart or the shout of a charity worker, as we explore the terrifying reality of hunger and the fragile, often rotten, lifeline that kept the prisoners from starving in the dark. The hunger of a medieval prison was not a sudden event. It was a slow, quiet erosion, a tide that receded day by day until the body was left stranded on the dry sand of starvation. We must now understand the most terrifying administrative fact of the medieval justice system. In most jurisdictions, the authorities had absolutely no legal obligation to feed you. Today, we assume that if the state locks a man up, the state must keep him alive. But the medieval mind saw imprisonment as a private matter between the accused and his accuser, or between the debtor and his creditor. The king provided the stone box, but he did not provide the kitchen. This led to a grim reality where survival was entirely dependent on what historians call the economy of the stomach. For the vast majority of prisoners, specifically those on the common side, who had no money to buy meals from the jailer's taproom, life became a singular, desperate obsession with sourcing the next calorie. The standard ration, if one existed at all, was often limited to the county bread, a loaf of such low quality that it was sometimes referred to as horse bread, made from a coarse mixture of beans, peas, oats, and rye, often baked days or weeks prior. It was hard enough to break a tooth on, sometimes green with mold, and frequently cut with sawdust or grit to increase its weight. This was the bread and water diet of legend, but the reality was far less romantic than the phrase suggests. The bread was a stone in the cut, and the water was often a poison. Water in a medieval prison was rarely drawn from a clean well. More often, it was scooped from the nearest available source, which in the case of castle dungeons or city gatehouses was usually a stagnant cistern or the city ditch, the very same ditch that served as the sewer for the population above. To drink it was to gamble with dysentery every time the cup touched the lips. Yet, even this meager sustenance was not guaranteed. In many prisons, the allowance was non-existent, forcing the prisoners to rely on a lifeline that was unique to the era: the begging grate. If you walk past certain old churches or almshouses in Europe today, You might see a small barred window at street level. In the Middle Ages, this was the lung through which the prison breathed. The grate was a window facing the busy public street, through which the prisoners could thrust a hand, a cup, or a hat, crying out to the passers-by for bread for the poor prisoners. It creates a haunting image. The free citizens of the city walking to market, stepping around the desperate pale hands, reaching out from the masonry like grasping roots. It was a social ritual, a public performance of misery, where the condemned had to sing, pray, or wail to attract the attention of the charitable. There was often a hierarchy even here. The boxman was a trusted prisoner, allowed to stand at the grate with a collecting box, sometimes shouting a standardized rhythmic chant to guilt the pedestrians into dropping a farthing or a crust of bread into the gloom. Good people, pity the poor debtors, having no allowance but what comes from your charity, was a common refrain that drifted through the streets of London, a background hum of suffering that blended with the cries of the fishmongers and the blacksmiths. This reliance on begging meant that a prisoner's survival often depended on the weather or the season. In the harsh winter, when fewer people walked the streets, the intake at the grate dropped, and the death rate inside the walls spiked. It also meant that imprisonment was a communal burden. The city fed its prisoners not through taxes, but through direct, hand-to-hand pity. However, there was another source of food, one that speaks to the strange, complex morality of the Middle Ages, the bequest. Wealthy merchants and guilt-ridden nobles often left specific instructions in their wills to provide food for prisoners, believing that this act of mercy would shorten their own time in purgatory. It was a spiritual transaction. I feed the prisoner on earth. God feeds my soul in the afterlife. Major city guilds would send baskets of broken meats, the leftovers from their lavish feasts, to the local jail. One can only imagine the chaotic, feral scene when the great basket arrived. A localized riot in the dark as starving men fought over the cold, half-eaten ribs of beef and the heels of fine white bread that had graced a lord's table only hours before. Historians have noted that this charity was often the only thing preventing mass starvation in places like Newgate or the Clink. Yet even this system was corrupt. Jailers frequently intercepted the best of the charity food, skimming the cream off the top for their own tables and leaving the refuse for the intended recipients. We must also consider the savor of starvation. The medieval prison was often located in the center of the town, meaning the smells of the outside world drifted in through the vents. A prisoner could smell the roasting pigs of the market, the baking bread of the ovens, and the spiced wine of the taverns, all while chewing on a piece of leather or hunting a rat in the dark. This olfactory torture was constant, a reminder of the biological exclusion they suffered. Scholarly debate still circles around the extent of deliberate starvation as a policy. Some historians argue that in cases of peine forte et dure, where a prisoner refused to plead, starvation was a specific, calibrated torture, with the prisoner given only stagnant water on one day and bread of the worst quality on the next, in an alternating cycle designed to weaken the will without killing the body too quickly. But for most, starvation was simply a byproduct of neglect, a passive violence. The body, denied fuel, began to consume itself. First, the fat reserves, then the muscle, and finally the organs. The lethargy that set in, the prison stupor, was actually the body shutting down non-essential systems to preserve the brain and heart. Prisoners moved slower, spoke less, and slept more, entering a hibernation of the doomed. Touching, if macabre, folklore that suggests some prisoners survived by eating the very parchment of their legal rights, consuming the law that confined them. Though this is likely a myth born of the desperate chewing on anything that wasn't stone. What is fact is that the inequality of the calorie was the most defining feature of the prison. While the poor man at the grate begged for a moldy crust, the man in the cell next door, separated only by a wooden partition or a few feet of hallway, might be dining on roast capon and drinking claret. This brings us to the sharpest edge of the filthy truth. The medieval prison was not a monolith of suffering. It was a mirror of the world outside, reflecting its brutal class divide with perfect, cruel clarity. Survival was not just about finding food. It was about who you were before the door locked. To understand this, we must look away from the begging grate and the starving commoner and turn our gaze to the master's side, where the table is set, the fire is lit, and the experience of imprisonment is entirely, shockingly different. To walk through a medieval prison was to traverse two distinct universes, separated by nothing more than a few inches of oak planking and the jingle of a purse. We have spent much time in the shadows with the forgotten, but to understand the full, surreal scope of incarceration in the Middle Ages, we must now ascend the stairs, leaving the damp hole behind, and step into the master's side. Here, the air changes instantly. The stench of ammonia and rot is replaced by the scent of roasted meat, dried lavender, and beeswax candles. The silence of the tomb is broken by the sound of laughter, the pouring of wine, and perhaps even the strumming of a lute. This is the tale of two prisoners, a story of radical inequality where justice was not blind, it was simply expensive. The medieval prison was a mirror of the feudal world that built it, maintaining the strict hierarchies of the outside world even within the walls. If you were a lord in the sunlight, you remained a lord in the dark, provided you could pay the rent. For the wealthy prisoner, a rebellious baron, a fallen courtier, or a rich merchant caught in a debt dispute, imprisonment was not a physical torture, but a financial hemorrhage. Upon arrival, such a man would not be thrown into the pit. Instead, he would negotiate with the warden or the marshal for a private chamber, often located in one of the upper towers where the air was fresh and the windows were glazed with actual glass rather than open to the wind. These were not cells in the modern sense. They were unfurnished apartments. The wealthy prisoner was expected to outfit his own cage, and so trains of servants would arrive at the prison gate carrying feather beds, heavy tapestries to cover the stone walls, carved oak chairs, silver plate, and chests of fine clothing. It is a bizarre, historical image. A man moving into prison as if he were moving into a summer home, bringing the comforts of his castle with him to soften the blow of confinement. In this gilded cage, life proceeded with a surreal normalcy. The noble prisoner was often allowed to keep his personal servants with him. Valets, cooks, and pages who voluntarily entered the prison to serve their master, sleeping on trundle beds at the foot of his mattress. He could receive visitors freely. His wife might come for dinner, his lawyer for consultation, and his business partners to sign contracts. There are records of prisoners in the Tower of London and the Fleet Prison hosting lavish dinner parties, where the wine flowed freely and the jailer himself might be an honored guest at the table, toasting the health of the man he was holding captive. The easement of irons here was absolute. For a substantial fee, the heavy shackles were removed entirely, or replaced with a symbolic, lightweight chain worn only during official inspections. The wealthy prisoner could often walk the liberties or the prison gardens during the day, breathing fresh air and looking out over the city or the countryside, separated from freedom only by a wall and a word of honor. Yet, this comfort was precarious, a luxury built on a foundation of extortion. The jailer knew the depth of his guests' pockets and charged accordingly. The rent for a private room was exorbitant, often 10 or 20 times the cost of a room in a city inn. Every log thrown on the fire, every bottle of wine uncorked, and every visitor who walked through the door came with a surcharge. The wealthy prisoner was a cash cow to be milked, and the jailer was an aggressive dairyman. This created a unique psychological terror for the gentleman prisoner, the fear of running out of money. The line between the master's side and the common side was porous. If the funds from the estate dried up, or if the family outside stopped sending coin, the privileges evaporated overnight. The tapestries would be sold to pay the debt, the servant would be evicted, the private room would be locked, and the lord would be dragged downstairs to the filth of the common ward. The descent was sudden and brutal, a fall from grace that landed on hard stone. Contrast this, then, with the man in the cellar directly beneath the noble's feet, the common prisoner. The thief, the vagrant, the poor debtor lived in a world where the only furniture was the floor, and the only servant was the louse. While the noble dined on capon and claret, the commoner fought over the sheriff's loaf. While the noble slept on goose down, the commoner slept on the litter, a communal pile of straw that was churned into a compost of mud and waste. The visual contrast was stark. Upstairs was a world of color, firelight, and velvet. Downstairs was a monochromatic world of grey stone, brown rags, and black shadows. The acoustic separation, however, was rarely perfect. It is a haunting thought that the starving men in the basement could likely hear the footsteps and the muffled laughter of the feast upstairs, a sonic reminder of the life they were denied. Conversely, did the noble hear the screams from below? Historians suggest that thick rugs and heavy tapestries were used not just for warmth, but for soundproofing, to insulate the conscience of the rich from the reality of the poor. There was also a difference in the very nature of their time. For the noble, prison was a waiting game, often a political maneuver. He was a hostage of high value, and it was in the king's interest to keep him alive for ransom or negotiation. His time was filled with reading, writing. Sir Walter Raleigh famously wrote his History of the World while imprisoned in the Tower and managing his affairs. For the commoner, time was a weapon of destruction. He had no ransom value. He was essentially biological waste. His time was filled with the slow degradation of his body and mind. The inequality extended even to death. If a noble died in prison, his body was treated with respect, released to his family for a proper burial in the family crypt. If a commoner died, he was often buried in the prisoner's patch, an unmarked mass grave in the prison yard, or simply tossed into the city ditch if the fees for burial were not paid. This dichotomy reveals the filthy truth that medieval justice was not a universal standard, but a commercial transaction. The prison was a microcosm of the unfair world, distilled to its essence. It demonstrated that money could buy more than just goods. It could buy immunity from physical suffering. The two prisoners might have been held within the same walls, breathing the same air, and technically serving the same sentence. But they were never in the same prison. One was in a hotel with bars, the other was in a grave with a door. This stark division was nowhere more visible than in the great prisons of London, where the geography of the building itself solidified this social apartheid. We must now leave the general concept of the castle and step into the specific, muddy reality of the riverside to visit two of the most notorious names in penal history, the Clink and the Marshalsea. These were not just places of confinement. They were institutions that swallowed neighborhoods, governed by bishops and feared by everyone. As we step out of the castle, keep and on to the foggy banks of the Thames, we prepare to enter the Southwark stew, where the prison and the brothel lived side by side. To find the beating dark heart of London's penal history, we must turn our backs on the city walls, walk across the crowded, shop-lined span of Old London Bridge, and step into the mud and fog of Southwark. Here, on the south bank of the Thames, lay a district that operated under its own peculiar set of rules, a legal loophole known as the Liberty of the Clink. It is a place where history feels particularly heavy, damp with the river's breath, and slick with the memories of 1,000 sins. The irony of Southwark is that this chaotic playground of bear-baiting pits, theatres, alehouses, and brothels was under the direct jurisdiction not of a secular lord, but of the Bishop of Winchester. The bishop's palace stood here, a magnificent residence of stone and glass. But it is not the palace we remember. It is the prison he kept next door. The Clink was essentially the bishop's private dungeon, a place to hold those who broke the peace of the liberty, creating a bizarre ecosystem where the church collected rent from the brothels, whose workers were cynically nicknamed Winchester geese, and then locked those same women up when they became too unruly. It was a vertically integrated business of sin and punishment that would have made a modern venture capitalist nod in appreciation. The prison itself was small compared to the great castles, but its reputation was so foul, so concentrated in its misery, that its name became the universal slang for prison itself, the Clink. Etymologists and historians still argue politely over the origins of the name. Some insist it is pure onomatopoeia, the sharp metallic sound of the blacksmith hammering the fetters shut or the rattling of chains against the floor. Others suggest it derives from a specific type of Flemish door latch used in the area. Regardless of the word's birth, the reality was a nightmare of hydroengineering. The Clink was situated so close to the riverbank that at high tide, the Thames would rise and seep into the lower cells. We must imagine the psychological terror of the prisoner chained in the sub-cellar, watching the water level slowly creep up the wall, feeling the cold river sludge swirling around their ankles, then their knees, praying that the tide would turn before it reached their chin. It was a water clock of death, a twice-daily baptism in the filth of London. The damp was absolute. The floors were perpetually slick with river slime, and the air was heavy with the smell of low tide, that distinct sulfuric mix of rotting vegetation and city runoff. To be in the Clink was to be slowly marinated in the river. A stone's throw away stood the Marshalsea, a prison with a slightly more bureaucratic, yet equally devastating purpose. While the clink held heretics, rebellious actors, and night walkers, the Marshalsea was primarily the holding pen for the court of the Marshalsea, which dealt with crimes committed within the verge of the king's royal household. However, it soon became synonymous with debt. In the medieval economy, debt was a moral failing treated with incarceration, a paradox that ruins lives to this day. You are locked up because you cannot pay, and because you are locked up, you cannot earn the money to pay. The Marshalsea operated like a tragic, inverted city. It had its own internal economy, its own tavern, and even its own common council of prisoners who tried to self-govern the chaos. But the reality was grim. We have records from the 14th century describing conditions where men lay dead for days before being removed, and where the crushing overcrowding meant prisoners were forced to sleep in shifts, spooned together for warmth in the straw. It was here that the fragility of the social contract was most visible. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, one of the first things the rebels did under Wat Tyler was to smash open the Marshalsea and the clink. It wasn't just a strategic move, it was an act of visceral liberation. Imagine the scene, the roaring mob tearing the iron gates off their hinges, the bewildered, squinting prisoners stumbling out into the daylight, the sudden intoxicating taste of freedom before the king's armies restored order. For a brief moment, the stone shell cracked. The social history of these riverside prisons is also the history of religious persecution. In the clink, the bishop imprisoned the Lollards, early religious reformers who dared to read the Bible in English, and later, during the turbulent Tudor shifts, it held Catholics and Protestants in alternating cycles of suffering. The posts of the clink became legendary. Prisoners were chained to heavy wooden posts in the center of the room, forced to stand for hours or days, a torture of posture that left the legs swollen and the back screaming. Yet, amidst this cruelty, the weird humor of the human spirit survived. There are accounts of prison games played in the dark, of songs composed to the rhythm of the dripping water, and of the dark camaraderie that forms between men who have nothing left to lose. The Winchester geese, who died in the prison, were denied Christian burial in consecrated ground, despite the bishop profiting from their trade in life. They were buried in a plot known as Crossbones, a sad, unconsecrated garden of outcasts that still exists as a shrine to the forgotten. The location of these prisons contributed to their unique horror. Southwark was the entertainment district, the place of noise and life. A prisoner in the clink could hear the roar of the crowd at the bear-baiting ring, the music from the taverns, and the shouting of the ferrymen. To be so close to the vibrant, chaotic joy of medieval London, to hear the life of the city through the thickness of a wall, must have been a sharper torture than the silence of a remote dungeon. It was a taunt. You were separated from the feast, not by miles, but by inches of masonry and the lack of a key. The Marshalsea sickness became a known term for the wasting disease that took those who stayed too long, a combination of malnutrition and despair. It is worth noting that while the rich could buy their way into the master's side, here too, the proximity to the river meant that even the best rooms were damp. Money could buy wine, but it couldn't buy a dry floor when the Thames decided to visit. As we stand in the imaginary mud of Southwark, looking at the crumbling walls of the bishop's palace, we realize that these prisons were the trash compactors of the capital. They took the unwanted, the debtors, the heretics, the poor, the prostitutes, and squeezed them into the riverbank until they either paid up or expired. The Clink and the Marshalsea were not high-security fortresses. They were rotting sheds of wood and stone, held together by the fear of the law and the apathy of the public. They remind us that the medieval justice system was often localized, messy, and deeply hypocritical, run by holy men who kept unholy ledgers. But as we look across the grey, churning water of the Thames towards the northern bank, we see a silhouette that commands a different kind of fear. It is not a rotting riverside jail, but a sharp, white tooth of stone rising against the sky. It is the Fortress of Kings, the place where the names are not forgotten, but are carved into history books with blood. We must now leave the mud of the debtors and cross the water to the place where queens and princes went to vanish. The Clink was for the unfortunate, the Tower was for the doomed. Crossing the grey, churning width of the Thames from the squalor of Southwark, we approach a silhouette that dominated the medieval skyline and the medieval imagination: the Tower of London. If the Clink was a rotting shed for the forgotten, the Tower was a cold, white tooth of stone reserved for those the world could not afford to forget. It stands as the ultimate paradox of the era, for it was simultaneously a royal palace, a secure fortress, a mint, a menagerie, and the most terrifying state prison in the kingdom. To be sent here was a dark compliment. It meant you were dangerous enough to matter. The Tower is not a single building, but a concentric complexity of 21 different towers. A stone village enclosed by double walls and a moat with a massive Norman keep, the White Tower brooding at its center. This was the Tower's many faces, a place where the king might be feasting in the Great Hall, while his cousin, his brother, or his rival sat in a chamber 100 yards away, staring at the same moon through a barred window. The intimacy of it is chilling. The oppressor and the oppressed lived as neighbors, separated only by the thickness of a door and the whim of politics. The journey to this high-status purgatory often began not on land, but on water. The Traitor's Gate, originally known simply as the Water Gate, sits low against the river line, a dark, dripping archway that swallows the tide. We must imagine the sensory experience of the prisoner, perhaps a fallen duke or a disgraced chancellor, being rowed silently down the river under the cover of night, the boat slipping beneath that heavy stone arch where the water laps loudly against the mossy steps. It was a passage from the living world into a liminal space of stone and silence. Once the iron portcullis crashed down behind the boat, splashing into the river mud, the world of the city, with its noise and its freedom, was gone. The architecture here was designed to intimidate, built by William the Conqueror specifically to subdue the unruly citizens of London, and centuries later, it still exuded an aura of crushing permanence. The walls are not just thick, they feel eternal, as if the stone itself is judging you. Yet once inside, the reality of life for the high-born prisoner was often surprisingly domestic, creating a gilded cage that confuses our modern understanding of a dungeon. For a medieval aristocrat, imprisonment in the Tower did not necessarily mean the rack or the pit. It often meant house arrest in a reasonably comfortable apartment within one of the mural towers, like the Bloody Tower or the Beauchamp Tower. They were allowed to bring their own furniture, their own tapestries to keep out the chill, and their own servants to cook their meals. There are records of prisoners having the liberty of the leads, meaning they could walk along the lead-lined roofs of the castle walls for exercise, looking down at the bustling city that was now denied to them. Some kept libraries, others wrote poetry or histories. The Earl of Northumberland, imprisoned in the Wizard Earl's Tower, had a laboratory installed for his alchemical experiments. It was a strange, suspended existence where the prisoner was treated with all the courtesy due their rank, yet remained utterly powerless to leave. It was a hotel where the bill was freedom and the checkout time was death. However, we must not let the velvet curtains fool us. The terror was psychological. The tower was a machine of uncertainty. A prisoner might languish here for 10 years, forgotten by the court, or be summoned to the block tomorrow morning. There was no sentence, only the king's pleasure. And the walls themselves bear witness to this agonizing boredom and fear. In the Beauchamp Tower, the stone walls are covered in intricate graffiti carved by prisoners over the centuries, coats of arms, prayers in Latin, names, and dates, painstakingly chiseled with nails or knives, hour after hour. These are not crude scratches. They are works of art born of desperate idleness, a way for men to shout, "I was here," into the silence of stone. One carving simply reads, "The more suffering for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the next." Touching these carvings today, one feels a direct, vibrating connection to the anxiety of the hands that made them. They are the scars of the building, the frozen screams of men who waited for a messenger who might never come. But the tower had a basement, and here the gilded cage vanished. Beneath the white tower lay the darker, damper cells, including the infamous Little Ease. A cell mentioned earlier, but perfected here. A space of 4 feet square, where a man could neither stand nor lie, designed to break the will through pure geometric cruelty. Here, in the deep foundations, the air was stale and the river damp permeated everything. We must also acknowledge a forgotten chapter of the tower's history. In the 13th century, under Edward the Fund, the tower's jury was crowded with hundreds of Jewish men and women, imprisoned solely for their faith and their wealth, many of whom were executed or died of neglect in the overcrowded crypts. The tower was a chameleon. It could be a gentleman's club for a rebellious lord one day, and a slaughterhouse for a minority the next. The oubliette in the White Tower, a hole in the floor of a dungeon leading to a lightless void, reminds us that even here, in the royal palace, the option to simply disappear someone was always available. The soundscape of the tower was unique. It was quiet, removed from the roar of London, punctuated only by the changing of the guard, the tolling of the bell in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and the croaking of the ravens, birds that legend said held the fate of the kingdom in their wings, but which in reality were likely just scavengers drawn to a place where meat was occasionally plentiful. The proximity of death was casual. The scaffold on Tower Hill, just outside the walls, was for public executions, a theatre of blood for the masses. But the green inside the walls was for the private removal of the sensitive, the queens and the favorites who knew too much. To look out your window and see the grass where you might die was a specific cold torture that no tapestry could hide. The tower was a place where history held its breath, where the princes in the tower, 2 young boys, heirs to the throne, could vanish into the mist of 1483, leaving behind only a mystery and a sensation of profound, innocent loss that still clings to the stones of the bloody tower. As the fog rolls off the Thames and wraps around the white tower, blurring its edges, we realize that this building is the ultimate symbol of the state's power to control the body. It is beautiful, terrifying, and utterly indifferent. It stands as a reminder that in the medieval world, safety was an illusion. If the king wanted you, stone walls would rise around you, no matter how high your birth. But while the tower is famous for its kings and princes, there is a quieter, often overlooked population that suffered within these walls and others like them. The medieval prison was not a male-only club. We must now turn our gaze from the graffiti of the lords to the shadows where the voices are softer. But the pain is just as sharp. We must look at the women, the wives, the mothers, and the scolds who found themselves trapped in a system designed by men for men, and see how the filthy truth treated those it considered the fairer but weaker sex. The history of the dungeon is often written in the masculine voice, a narrative of kings, knights, and thieves. But the shadows of the medieval prison held a silence that was distinctly, tragically female. We must now peel back the layer of assumption that suggests these stone boxes were exclusive clubs for men to reveal the women in the walled dark. In the harsh reality of the medieval penal system, gender offered no shield. In fact, being a woman often transformed the prison from a place of mere confinement into a landscape of specific, gendered terror. The first and most shocking realization for the modern observer is the almost total lack of segregation. In many local jails, castle keeps, and gatehouses, there was no separate women's wing. Men and women were frequently thrown together into the same communal pits, separated perhaps by a flimsy wooden partition, or more often, by nothing at all. This lack of architectural privacy turned the prison into a predatory environment where safety was non-existent. A woman cast into the common side was not just fighting the cold and the rats. She was fighting for her bodily autonomy every hour of the day, surrounded by men who had already been discarded by society. The figure of the jailer looms large here, not just as a greedy merchant of fees, but as a sexual predator. In a system where food, water, and bedding were commodities to be bought, women who had no money were often forced to pay with their bodies. The filthy truth is that sexual coercion was a baked-in part of the prison economy. A woman alone, without a husband or powerful family to advocate for her, was considered fair game. Records from the era hint at this darkness with grim euphemisms, but the reality was stark. Rape was an unwritten hazard of the sentence. The power dynamic was absolute. The man with the keys held the power of life and death, and resistance could mean being chained in the hole or starved. This exploitation wasn't just a rogue occurrence. In some notorious instances, jailers acted as pimps, effectively turning the women's section of the prison into a brothel for outside visitors, monetizing their female captives in the most brutal way imaginable. The Winchester geese of the clink were not just women who worked in brothels. They were women who were often forced to continue that work inside the prison to pay their jail fees. Yet, there is a sound even more heartbreaking than the weep of the condemned, the cry of a newborn. One of the most unique legal mechanisms of the time was the plea of pregnancy, or pleading the belly. In a society that brutally punished theft with hanging, a pregnant woman condemned to death could claim her condition to buy time. The law forbade the execution of an unborn child, so the sentence would be stayed until the baby was born. This created a perverse incentive for women to become pregnant while in prison, sometimes by the very guards who oppressed them, as a desperate strategy to delay the hangman. But this reprieve came at a terrible cost, giving birth in a medieval dungeon. We must try to imagine the sensory nightmare of labor on a bed of filthy, lice-ridden straw in freezing temperatures, with no midwife, no hot water, and no sanitation. Many women died of puerperal fever, childbed fever, within days, their bodies too weakened by malnutrition to survive the trauma. For the infants who survived, their first breath was the stale air of the jail, and their first sight was the grey stone of the ceiling. This leads us to the prison-born and the children who followed their parents into the dark. In the case of debtors, entire families would sometimes accompany the father into prison because they had nowhere else to go and no means to support themselves on the outside. The prison became a grotesque nursery. Children grew up in the shadow of the gallows, playing games with rat bones in the courtyard, learning the vocabulary of theft and extortion before they could read. The psychological impact on a child raised in such an environment, where violence was the norm and sunlight a luxury, is almost impossible to quantify. They were institutionalized from birth, absorbing the trauma of the cage into their developing bones. These children were the collateral damage of a legal system that saw the family unit as a single economic entity. If the head failed, the body suffered. Women were also the primary targets of specific terrifying accusations that landed them in the deepest cells: witchcraft and heresy. The witch's cell was often a place of sensory deprivation designed to break the mind. Suspected witches were kept awake for days, walking the witch, forced to pace their cells without rest until they hallucinated confessions. They were watched constantly by watchers, looking for the appearance of a familiar, a demon in animal form, meaning that even a stray mouse entering the cell could be used as legal evidence of a pact with Satan. The vulnerability of the female body was obsessed over. Women were stripped and shaved in cold rooms by male searchers looking for witches' marks, a violation that was a form of torture in itself. The famous case of Petronilla de Meath in Ireland, the first woman burned for heresy there, reminds us that the prison was often just the anteroom to the stake. For these women, the prison was not just a holding pen. It was a torture chamber where their gender was weaponized against them. There were also the scolds, women accused of being too loud, too argumentative, or too defiant of their husbands, while the scold's bridle, an iron muzzle with a tongue depressor, and the ducking stool were public punishments. The women were often held in the town jail before and after. These women were imprisoned essentially for the crime of having a voice. The atmosphere of the prison for a woman was one of total, crushing silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of suppression. To speak up was to invite the bridle, to resist was to invite the chain. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, there were flickers of resilience. Female prisoners formed networks of care, sharing food, helping with births, and protecting the younger girls from the guards as best they could. There are stories of high-born women, like the future Queen Elizabeth of Morris, imprisoned in the Tower by her sister Mary, who used their time to sharpen their minds and prepare for a future they hoped would come. But for the common woman, the filthy truth was that the medieval prison was a trap designed to exploit her vulnerability. It was a place where she was stripped of her role as mother, wife, or daughter, and reduced to a body to be taxed, used, or burned. As we leave the weeping walls of the women's ward, hearing the faint echo of a lullaby hummed in the dark, a sound of defiant tenderness in a place of cruelty, we realize that the state was not the only power that built prisons. There was another authority, one that claimed to hold the keys not just to the cell, but to the afterlife. We must now turn our steps away from the king's castle and toward the monastery and the cathedral. Here, in the shadow of the cross, we find a different kind of confinement, one born of silence and prayer, where the goal was not to punish the body, but to break the soul into repentance. We enter the church's quiet cells, leaving the chaotic, noisy misery of the secular jail. We step now into a different kind of shadow, a shadow cast not by a castle wall, but by the spire of a cathedral. Here, the air is cooler, stiller, and carries the faint scent of incense and old parchment rather than river mud. We are entering the jurisdiction of the Holy Church, a parallel legal universe that operated alongside the king's law, claiming authority over the souls and bodies of the clergy, the heretic, and the sinner. This is the world of the church's quiet cells. And while the violence here was often less bloody than the sheriff's dungeon, it was designed with a terrifying psychological precision. The church operated under the Latin maxim, Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. The church abhors blood. This sounds merciful, suggesting a refusal to execute or mutilate. But in practice, it meant that ecclesiastical authorities had to find creative ways to punish the body without breaking the skin. The result was the invention of the penitentiary, a concept that would centuries later inspire the modern prison system, where the goal was not just to hold the prisoner, but to crush their spirit into repentance through the sheer weight of silence. To understand this, we must look at the monastic prison, or the carcer, hidden within the thick walls of the abbey or the convent. For a wayward monk or a rebellious nun, punishment did not mean a public flogging in the market square. It meant immurement. The term comes from the Latin murus, meaning wall, and refers to the practice of shutting the offender away in a solitary cell, cut off from the community of the brothers. There were degrees of this isolation. Murus largus, liberal wall, allowed the prisoner to move around a small cloister and speak to others. But for the serious offender, the blasphemer, the thief of holy relics, there was murus strictus, strict wall. This was a windowless cell, often no larger than a coffin standing on end, where the prisoner was chained in absolute darkness. In some chilling accounts, the door was bricked up, leaving only a small slit for food to be passed through, effectively burying the man alive within the architecture of the church. The phrase used to condemn a monk to this fate was "vade in pace," go in peace. It was a horrifying euphemism, for the peace intended was the silence of the grave. The psychology of this confinement was radically different from the king's prison. The secular jail didn't care what you thought, as long as you didn't escape. The church cared deeply what you thought. The cell was a crucible designed to burn away the sin and leave only the pure, repentant soul. To achieve this, the primary weapon was not hunger, though the diet was often the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. but solitude. In the secular prison, you were crowded with others, sharing warmth and complaints. In the church cell, you were utterly alone with your own mind. We must imagine the terror of a medieval mind, deeply superstitious and fearful of demons, locked in total darkness for weeks or months. The silence was not empty. It was a canvas upon which the guilty conscience painted its worst fears. Monastic chronicles speak of prisoners succumbing to laxity, a spiritual torpor or despair, or being tormented by visions of the devil in the corner of the cell. The quiet cell was an echo chamber for the soul, forcing the prisoner to confront their own depravity without distraction. Historians argue that this is the true birthplace of solitary confinement. It was here, in the dark underbelly of the monastery, that the idea of reforming a prisoner through isolation was born. But the physical conditions were often just as lethal as the worst dungeon. These cells were frequently located in the crypts or the foundations of the church, where the cold was intense. Since the prisoner was often forbidden from working or moving much, the lack of circulation led to rapid physical decline. The bishop's prison for heretics was often a deep cistern or a pit. When the Knights Templar were suppressed in the early 14th century, many of the elderly knights were imprisoned in church dungeons, chained to walls, in conditions so damp and vile that their bones, when discovered centuries later, showed signs of crippling arthritis and deformation. They had been warriors of God, yet they died in the twisted agony of the church's own mercy. There is a specific, haunting detail found in some of these ecclesiastical prisons: the leper's squint or hagioscope. In some cases, the cell would have a small narrow tunnel cut through the stone wall, directed towards the high altar of the church. This allowed the prisoner, crouching in the dark, to see the priest elevating the host during Mass and to hear the chanting of the choir. It was intended as a mercy, a way to allow the sinner to participate in the liturgy from afar. But consider the psychological torture of it, to be able to see the light, the gold, and the salvation, to hear the beautiful music of your brothers, while remaining chained in the cold and filth, separated by an impassable wall of stone. It reinforced the exclusion, turning the Mass into a distant, taunting dream. You were close enough to God to see Him, but too sinful to touch Him. The Church also dealt with sanctuary, a concept that turned the Church itself into a temporary prison. A fugitive fleeing the law could claim sanctuary by touching the knocker of the church door or sitting on the frith stool near the altar. Once inside, the king's men could not touch him. However, the church could not let him go, nor could they feed him forever. The fugitive was effectively imprisoned within the church, sometimes for 40 days, while the sheriff's men surrounded the building, waiting for him to step out. It was a siege of one man. If he refused to abjure the realm, confess, and leave the country barefoot, the church would eventually starve him out. There are grim accounts of men dying of hunger in the sanctuary, clutching the altar cloth, safe from the hangman, but not from the hollow belly. The filthy truth here is that the church's hands were clean of blood, but they were stained with something else: the cold calculation of suffering. By reframing imprisonment as penance, they justified conditions that were objectively torturous. A man dying of pneumonia in a wet monastic cell was not being punished in their eyes. He was being purged. His suffering was a medicine, and the more bitter the taste, the more effective the cure. This theological justification made the cruelty harder to fight. You could bribe a secular jailer. He was just a businessman. But how do you bribe a jailer who believes he is saving your soul by letting you freeze? The moral certainty of the inquisitor or the abbot was a lock that no key could open. As we stand in the hushed, stone-flagged corridor of the cloister, listening to the muffled sound of a monk coughing in a walled-up cell, we realize that the darkness of the Middle Ages was not just a lack of light. It was a belief that pain was a necessary path to truth. The church used silence and time to break the will, but sometimes silence was not enough. Sometimes the authorities needed answers, and they needed them quickly. The cell was for waiting, but the question required a different room. We must now leave the quiet of the crypt and descend even deeper, to a place where the maxim abhorrita sanguine was stretched to its absolute breaking point, and where the tools of the trade were not prayer books, but iron, rope, and fire. We enter the chamber of the question. From the suffocating silence of the monastic cell, we descend now into a room where silence was the one thing forbidden. We are entering the domain of the question, a euphemism so polite it almost hides the brutality behind it. In the medieval legal mind, particularly on the continent where Roman law held sway, there was a terrible obsession with certainty. A judge could not condemn a man to death on circumstantial evidence alone. He needed the queen of proofs, the confessio, the confession, and if the prisoner would not speak the truth voluntarily, the law provided a mechanism to wring it out of him, drop by drop, like water from a wet cloth. This was not the chaotic violence of a brawl. It was a cold, bureaucratic procedure, a medical operation where the surgeon's goal was not to heal, but to break. The torture chamber was rarely a cavernous dungeon filled with screaming victims, as fiction suggests. More often, it was a small, focused room deep within the prison complex, intimate and terrifyingly ordinary. It contained a table, a chair for the scribe, a crucifix on the wall to remind everyone of the sanctity of the truth, and the instruments. The instruments were often displayed first. This was the first stage of the torture, the territio, or terrifying. The executioner, who often doubled as the torturer, would calmly explain the function of each device to the prisoner, laying them out like a craftsman displaying his tools. He would show the rack, a simple wooden frame designed to stretch the human body, until the joints popped from their sockets with a sickening dry crack. He would show the thumbscrews, small iron vices that could crush the delicate bones of the hands. He would show the water jugs used for the water cure, where gallons of fluid were forced down the throat until the stomach was distended to the point of bursting. For many prisoners, the sheer psychological horror of this guided tour was enough. The imagination is often a more potent torturer than the mechanic, and the words stumbled out before a single finger was touched. But for those who stayed silent, the procedure began. We must understand that this was a legal ritual. A scribe sat at the desk, dipping his quill into the ink, ready to record every word, every groan, and every admission. The torture was not meant to kill. A dead prisoner could not confess, so the torturer walked a razor's edge, inflicting the maximum amount of pain without crossing the line into fatal injury. This required a perverse kind of skill, an anatomical knowledge of how much a body could take. The strappado was a favorite technique because it left no external marks. The prisoners' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a pulley, dislocating the shoulders instantly under the weight of their own body. It was clean, quick, and agonizing. While the prisoner hung there, swinging gently in the lantern light, the interrogator would ask the questions again, his voice calm, contrasting with the screaming of the suspended man. Who were your accomplices? When did you steal the chalice? Did you curse the king? The filthy truth of torture is that it worked, but it also lied. Under the duress of the rack or the boot, an iron casing driven into the leg with wooden wedges, a human being will say absolutely anything to make the pain stop. Innocence evaporated in that room. Men confessed to flying through the air, to plotting with demons, to crimes committed in cities they had never visited. The scribe wrote it all down, the quill scratching across the parchment, transforming these delirious screams into legal facts. Historians have analyzed these transcripts and found moments of heartbreaking clarity where the prisoner begs for death or asks the scribe to write whatever the judge wants to hear, just to end the session. In some jurisdictions, the law required the prisoner to repeat their confession freely the next day, away from the torture chamber, to validate it. Most did, terrified that if they retracted, they would be brought back to the room. The memory of the pain was a prison in itself, a wall that followed them even when they were unshackled. The sensory atmosphere of this room was distinct. It smelled of sweat, urine, and the iron tang of blood, mixed with the smoky residue of the torches that provided the heat for the pincers. It was hot, unlike the freezing cells, a stifling claustrophobic heat that made the air feel thick. The torturer was often a pariah in society, a man who lived on the edges of the town, feared and shunned, yet essential to the machinery of justice. In the prison, he was the master of ceremonies. He knew the body not as a temple, but as a mechanism of pulleys and levers that could be manipulated. There is a specific horror in the intimacy of it. The torturer had to touch the prisoner constantly, adjusting the ropes, turning the screws, checking the pulse. It was a physical closeness that mimicked care but delivered destruction. For the prisoner who survived the question, the return to the cell was a brutal transition. They were often dragged back, unable to walk, their joints swollen and useless, their bodies feverish with shock. They were thrown back onto the filthy straw of their cell. But now they were broken. The rats and the cold, which had been enemies before, were now lethal threats to a body that could no longer defend itself. A prisoner who had been racked could not feed themselves. They had to rely on the charity of cellmates to lift the water to their lips. Many died in the days following the torture, not from the devices themselves, but from the gangrene that set in, or simply from the failure of the heart. The question had been answered, but the life had been extinguished in the process. Yet, even in this abyss of pain, the human spirit sought to leave a mark, a proof of existence that would outlast the flesh. When the body was broken and the voice was silenced by the scribe's official lie, the prisoners turned to the only canvas they had left, the stone itself. They took nails, broken spoons, or shards of bone, and they began to scratch. We must now leave the torture chamber, the door closing on its dark secrets, and return to the towers and the keeps to witness the final testament of the condemned. We must run our fingers over the walls to read the voices on the walls, the graffiti that serves as the only true history of the people who rotted in the dark. These are not confessions extracted by pain. These are the voluntary whispers of the soul, carved deep enough to defy time. When the heavy oak door slammed shut and the jailer's footsteps faded away, the silence returned. But it was not an empty silence. If you press your ear against the rough masonry of a medieval cell today, you can almost hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of metal against stone, a sound that persisted for centuries like a slow heartbeat in the dark. We must now turn our flashlight onto the walls themselves to read them, voices on the walls, the only autobiography left behind by those who were meant to be erased. In a world without paper, ink, or light, the prisoners turned the very architecture of their confinement into a canvas, transforming the dungeon from a cage into a library of stone. This was not the idle vandalism of a modern restroom stall. This was a desperate, monumental effort to assert existence in the face of oblivion, to carve one's name into granite using nothing but a rusty nail, a sharpened spoon, or the buckle of a belt, is an act of supreme will. It is a slow, agonizing process where every curve of a letter represents hours of labor, weeks of blistered fingers, and months of determination to say, simply, I am. The Beauchamp Tower in the Tower of London serves as the cathedral of this tragic art form. Here, the walls are so thick with graffiti that the stone seems to be tattooed. We find the intricate, deeply cut coat of arms of the Dudley family, carved by the brothers of Lady Jane Grey while they awaited execution. It is a masterpiece of heraldry, complete with the bare and ragged staff, roses and acorns, framed by a border of flowers. The sheer precision of it is haunting. Imagine the young nobleman, knowing he would likely die by the axe, spending his final days meticulously sculpting the symbol of his family's honor, ensuring that even if his head was taken, his name would remain fixed in the geology of England. Near it, the single word Ian, Jane, is scratched, arguably by Guilford Dudley for his wife, a cry of grief immortalized in 4 letters. These carvings were not just decorations. They were anchors. In a system designed to strip a man of his titles, his lands, and his dignity, carving his coat of arms was an act of rebellion. It was a way of saying, you can chain my body, but you cannot unmake my blood. But it was not just the nobility who left their mark. In the lower dungeons and the common jails, the walls are covered in crude crosses, tally marks, and skeletal figures. Religion was the dominant theme. The IHS monogram, the name of Jesus, is found everywhere, often surrounded by thorns or drops of blood. These were not just images. They were prayers solidified. For the prisoner who could not go to church, the wall became the altar. They carved the Virgin Mary, the crucifixion, or Saint Peter, the patron saint of chains, creating a focal point for their desperate petitions. In the dungeons of Carlisle Castle, there is a mesmerizing crowded carving known as the Prisoner's Stone, filled with fantastical beasts, heraldic symbols, and mythological figures, likely the work of a Scottish prisoner during the Wars of Independence. It speaks of a mind trying to escape the cell by retreating into a world of imagination, populating the grey stone with dragons and knights to keep the madness at bay. The filthy truth of these carvings lies in the time they represent. To cut a single inch-deep line into hard limestone with a piece of scrap iron takes hours of repetitive scraping. A complex image represents months or years of captivity. The wall acts as a fossilized clock. The depth of the carving corresponds to the length of the sentence. We can trace the passage of time, not in minutes, but in the depth of the groove. Some carvings were left unfinished, a half-written name, a shield with no border, marking the sudden arrival of the executioner or the release of death. These interrupted lines are perhaps the most poignant of all, a sentence cut short in mid-syllable. There is also a darker geometry to be found, the astronomical and astrological diagrams. In the Tour de Constance in France, or the dungeons of the Inquisition, prisoners carved intricate calendars and horoscopes, trying to make sense of the cosmos that had seemingly turned against them. They tracked the phases of the moon they could not see, trying to predict their fate by the alignment of the stars. It was an attempt to impose order on chaos, to find a pattern in the suffering. The walls also hold curses, names of judges or accusers scratched upside down or crossed out. A stone hex meant to bring ruin upon those outside. And then there are the games. Fox and geese boards, nine men's Morris, and checkerboards are frequently found scratched into the floor stones or window ledges. These were not for posterity. They were for survival. Tools to kill the agonizing boredom that was often more lethal than the cold. We can imagine two prisoners shivering in the dark, moving pebbles across a grid scratched into the dirt, the game becoming their entire world for an hour. The medium itself, the stone, tells a story of physical interaction. The carvings are often located near the sources of light, clustered around the arrow slits or the window bars, where the prisoner could catch the last fading rays of the sun to work by. In some cells, the stone is worn smooth and shiny at shoulder height, polished by generations of men leaning against the same spot, a tactile ghost of the thousands of hours spent waiting. The dust from the carving would have coated the floor, mixing with the straw, a gritty reminder of the prisoner's labor. It is a profound realization that for many of these men and women, the carving was the only thing they could control. They couldn't choose their food, their temperature, or their company, but they could choose where to place the next scratch. It was the last vestige of agency. Today, tourists walk past these carvings, often touching them without realizing that they are touching the solidified anxiety of a dead man. We see them as art, but they were originally acts of defiance. They were status updates from the grave. A carving that reads, Thomas Mere, which lie the here alone, that fain wold, from hence be gone, by torture stronger, Jimmy Trouth was tried, yet of my liberty denied. Thomas Mayak, who lies here alone, who would fain be gone from here, by strange torture, my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied. Found in the Tower is not just a poem. It is a deposition. It is a testimony left for a future jury, us. It asks us to witness the injustice that the contemporary court ignored. As we run our fingers over the rough, cold letters of a name carved 500 years ago, we feel a strange connection. The flesh has rotted. The bones have turned to dust. The iron chains have rusted away, but the name remains. The prisoner won the final battle against the prison. The building was meant to silence them, to swallow them whole. But they shouted their name into the rock so deeply that the rock had to keep it. This persistence speaks to the incredible durability of the human spirit, but also to the profound need to find meaning in pain. Why did they carve? Because they believed their suffering had to matter. They believed that if they could just leave a record, their pain wasn't in vain. This brings us to the most difficult question of all. How did they endure it? What mental framework allowed a human being to sit in a wet, dark hole for 10 years and not simply lay down and die? To understand this, we must look beyond the stone and into the mind, to the philosophy of suffering that governed the medieval soul. To the modern mind, the conditions of the medieval prison, the filth, the dark, the rats, and the hunger, seem like a catalogue of senseless cruelty, a failure of empathy on a massive scale. We ask ourselves, how could they let this happen? But to the medieval mind, suffering was rarely senseless. It was, in fact, heavily burdened with meaning. We must now step away from the physical reality of the stone walls and enter the philosophy of suffering, the mental landscape that allowed men and women to endure the unendurable. In the Middle Ages, pain was not viewed as a mere biological error or an inconvenience to be medicated away. It was understood as a fundamental, perhaps even necessary, instrument of the soul's journey. The prison, therefore, was not just a holding pen for the body. It was viewed by many, including the prisoners themselves, as a terrestrial purgatory, a kiln where the heat of tribulation might burn away the impurities of sin before the final judgment. This theological framework provided a grim sort of comfort. If you were suffering, it meant God was still paying attention to you. We must remember that the most famous book written in a medieval prison was not a manual on escape, but the Consolation of Philosophy, written by the Roman statesman Boethius while he awaited execution in the 6th century, a text that became a bestseller throughout the Middle Ages. It argued that true freedom was internal, a state of mind that no jailer could touch. This Stoic ideal fused with Christian theology to create a powerful survival mechanism. Prisoners were encouraged to view their stone cell as a monastic cell, their isolation as a retreat, and their hunger as a fast. This was the concept of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. Since Jesus had suffered, been bound, and humiliated, the prisoner in irons was physically closer to the divine experience than the king on his throne. This belief turned the damp, freezing dungeon into a stage for spiritual heroism. When a prisoner carved a cross into the wall, they were not just doodling. They were aligning their personal agony with the cosmic order, transforming their misery into a form of currency that could purchase salvation. However, this philosophy had a dark, jagged edge. It provided the authorities with a convenient moral excuse for their neglect. If suffering was instructive and penitential, then making the prison comfortable would be spiritually negligent. To give a criminal a soft bed and warm food might actually endanger his soul by denying him the cleansing fire of tribulation. The filthy truth is that the medieval state offloaded its conscience onto God. The misery of the prisoner was not a sign of administrative failure, but of divine justice working its way through the flesh. The bishop who kept men in the flooded cellar of the clink could sleep soundly, believing that the cold water was washing away their heresy. This worldview allowed society to look at a starving wretch in a cage and see not a humanitarian crisis, but a moral lesson in progress. The prison was a visible sermon. Behold the wages of sin. This perspective extended to the legal understanding of the body. In the medieval worldview, the body was merely a vessel, often a corrupt one, that contained the soul. Therefore, the destruction of the body was acceptable if it served the truth or the law. This explains the callousness of the peine forte et dure, pressing a man to death with heavy stones if he refused to plead. It wasn't just torture. It was a physical manifestation of the weight of the law crushing the resistance of the individual. The body was expendable. The soul and the social order were not. This is why death was often seen as a release, not a tragedy. For the long-term prisoner, death was the great jail delivery, the final breaking of the chains. The records show a startling lack of panic in the face of death among many prisoners. They prepared for it with the ars moriendi, the art of dying, making their confessions, and distributing their meager belongings with a calm that unsettles the modern reader. They had already been dead to the world for years. The final breath was just a formality. Yet, we must not romanticize this. The philosophy was often a thin shield against the sheer biological terror of being eaten alive by lice or slowly starving. There were plenty who broke, who screamed, who cursed God and the king, and who died in a state of absolute howling despair. But for those who survived years in the dark, the mind had to build its own castle to replace the one they had lost. They constructed elaborate mental worlds, memorizing entire books of the Bible, composing poetry in their heads, or tracking the imaginary movements of the stars. The human brain, starved of stimulus, turned inward, finding a vastness in the microcosmos of the self. The silence of the prison, intended to destroy them, sometimes did the opposite. It distilled them. It stripped away the noise of the court, the market, and the family, leaving only the essential core of the person. This endurance also bred a unique subculture of dark humor and fatalism. The gallows humor we speak of today was born in these pits. Prisoners mocked the jailer, the judge, and death itself, finding a strange power in their own hopelessness. If you have already lost everything, you have nothing left to fear, and that is a dangerous kind of freedom. The graffiti of skeletons, dancing, or drinking is a testament to this defiant laughter in the dark. It was a refusal to be solemn in the face of the absurd cruelty of the system. The philosophy of suffering was not just about accepting pain. It was about mastering it, about refusing to let the stone enter the soul. As we near the end of our journey through the history of the medieval prison, we must recognize that this mindset is the great divide between us and them. We view the prison as a failure of society. They viewed it as a reflection of a fallen world. We seek to cure the criminal. They sought to balance the scales of the universe through pain. The walls they built were thick, but the walls in their minds, the beliefs about sin, judgment, and redemption, were stronger than any granite. And yet, granite does not last forever. The castles that once seemed eternal, the gates that looked like the mouths of hell, and the towers that touched the clouds have all succumbed to the one force that no jailer can bribe: time. The screams have faded, the wood has rotted, and the iron has rusted into orange dust. We must now step out of the philosophy and back into the physical world to stand before the ruins as they are today. We move to the final chapter, where the sunlight finally breaks through the broken roof and the prison becomes a garden. And so we come to the final truth of the medieval prison, the only truth that the kings and the jailers could not suppress. Stone is strong and iron is hard, but time is the patient, universal solvent that dissolves them all. We stand now in the morning light of the present day, looking at the ruins of the places that once terrified a continent. And we see that the ultimate liberator was not a judge or a paid ransom or a revolution, but the slow, grinding erosion of the centuries. The slowest key has finally turned in every lock. Walk with me one last time, not into the dark, but into the open air of a ruined castle. Perhaps Corfe in Dorset, or the shell of a border keep in Scotland. The roof is gone, blown away by storms, or dismantled by villagers needing stone for their cottages. The heavy oak doors have rotted into humus long ago, leaving the archways open like toothless mouths. The darkness that we spent so much time exploring has been banished by the simple, relentless arrival of the sun. Where the common-side prisoners once huddled in the pitch black, fighting over straw, wild grass now grows lush and green, fed by the rain that falls freely through the open sky. The oubliette, that terrifying bottle of forgetting, is now just a shallow depression in the turf, filled with dead leaves and wild flowers. The terrifying verticality of the prison has been flattened. The hierarchy of the master's side and the pit has been equalized by the collapse of the floors. Gravity, in the end, brought everyone to the same level. There is a profound, melancholic peace in these ruins. The ivy, with its soft green fingers, has strangled the masonry that once strangled men. It climbs the walls where the damp used to weep, turning the instrument of confinement into a garden. The silence here is no longer the silence of suppression. It is the silence of rest. The screams, the prayers, the rattling of chains, and the rough laughter of the jailer have all evaporated into the atmosphere, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the arrow slits and the call of the jackdaws nesting in the broken towers. It is strange to think that the birds are now the only residents, flying freely in and out of the cells that once held men for a lifetime. Nature has reclaimed the stone, reminding us that the prison was an unnatural imposition on the landscape, a temporary mistake of geometry that the earth has slowly corrected. The filthy truth has been washed clean by 500 years of rain. Yet, the legacy of these places survived long after the roofs fell in. The horror of the medieval prison, the sheer, wasteful brutality of the neglect, eventually sparked a light in the human conscience. It took centuries, but as the medieval world gave way to the Enlightenment, society began to look at the rotting man in the cage and feel a twinge of shame. The filthy truth became a scandal. Reformers in the 18th and 19th centuries, men and women like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry, walked into these dungeons and were sickened by what they saw, the very same conditions we have described. The garnish, the filth, the mixing of the innocent and the guilty. Their outrage marked the end of the medieval philosophy of custody as neglect. The prison did not disappear, but it changed. It transformed from a dark hole of waiting into the penitentiary, a place, for better or worse, of attempted correction. The idea that a prisoner had rights to food, to air, to safety from disease was a flower that grew from the compost of the medieval dungeon. The suffering we have witnessed was the crucible in which the modern concept of human rights was slowly, painfully forged. Today, we visit these sites as tourists. We pay a ticket price, ironically, a modern garnish, to walk through the Tower of London or the Conciergerie in Paris. We take photographs of the rack and the block, safely separated from the reality by velvet ropes and glass cases. The instruments of torture have been sterilized, turned into museum exhibits that give us a pleasurable shiver of horror, but can no longer bite. We read the graffiti on the walls of the Beauchamp Tower and for a moment we feel the presence of the earls and the plotters. But they are quiet ghosts now. They do not demand our pity, they simply demand our witness. The Clink Prison Museum in Southwark stands on the site of the Bishop's Old Jail, but the Winchester geese are gone, their pain buried deep beneath the asphalt of the London streets. The Marshalsea is mostly a brick wall and a plaque, a memory in a Dickens novel rather than a living hell. The physical destruction of these prisons is a victory for the human spirit. The Bastille, the ultimate symbol of the arbitrary medieval prison, was not just captured. It was torn down by hand, stone by stone, by the people of Paris, who then sold the rocks as souvenirs of liberty. They understood that some buildings are too heavy with sorrow to be allowed to stand. And what of the prisoners themselves? The thousands of nameless men and women who starved, froze, and waited in the dark. They have found the one thing the jailer could not sell them: release. The great jail delivery of death eventually came for them all, the master and the commoner alike. Their debts are cancelled, their crimes are forgotten, and their pain has ceased. The bones that lay in the unconsecrated ground of the Crossbones graveyard have turned to dust, merging with the clay of the riverbank, returning to the cycle of life. They are no longer cold. They are no longer hungry. The anxiety of the waiting is over. The voice on the wall is still there, carved in stone, but the hand that carved it is at rest. There is a gentle closure in realizing that history is a form of memory, and by remembering them tonight, by walking through the dark with them, we have, in a small way, visited them in their solitude. We have acknowledged their existence. We have paid their quit fee with our attention. As the sun sets over the ruins, casting long, purple shadows across the grass that covers the dungeon floor, the atmosphere shifts from tragedy to tranquility. The stone, once cold and damp, holds the warmth of the day's sun for a few hours into the twilight. The moon rises, the same moon that shone through the barred window 500 years ago, but now it shines on an empty stage. The drama is finished. The actors have gone home. The prison is broken, and in its breaking, it has become beautiful. We can leave it now. We can walk out through the gap where the gate used to be, crossing the dry moat where the wildflowers bloom, and step back into our own world, a world of light, of warmth, and of freedom. The heavy door does not slam behind us. There is no key turning in the lock. There is only the soft sigh of the wind in the ivy, a final exhaled breath of a history that has finally found its peace. We leave the shadows where they belong, in the past, and we carry the light with us, grateful for the comfort of a soft bed, a locked door that we control, and the safety of the quiet night. And now the journey is complete. The heavy iron gates of history have been left far behind you, rusting in the tall grass of time. The damp, cold stone has faded into the mist, replaced by the warmth and softness of your own sanctuary. You are safe here. The shadows we explored are merely stories now, drifting away like smoke from a dying candle. Feel the weight of the centuries lift from your shoulders, leaving you light and tranquil. The voices of the past have whispered their truths and fallen silent, resting in the quiet library of the night. There is nothing left to fear, nothing left to pay, nothing left to wait for. The world outside is still, the night is a gentle guardian, and the only sound is the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Close your eyes, Let the darkness be a comfort, not a cage, and drift down into the velvet deep. Sweet dreams.